things don't exist. And it's better than Meinongianism because it wasn't just Meinong's view. I mean, as I've just said. So I shall use nonism for the claim that some things don't exist. And what properties it is that non-existent objects have is, of course, a central issue in contemporary nonism. Okay, so then what I'll do in the last part of the talk, is revisit the grounds that the medieval logicians had for supposing that some things don't exist, and see, we'll have a brief look at what one might make of those in a contemporary context. So that's where we're going. All right, so part one, ampliation beyond the actual. I'll tell you what ampliation is in a second. So we are in the late 13th, 14th century. So this is the high era of medieval logic, and it's a fabulous period, very sophisticated. There are all sorts of debates going on, as there are in contemporary logic, but there is a kind of orthodoxy about many matters, including the topic that I'm going to talk about, which is ampliation. I'll tell you what that is in a second. But these guys are not inventing the wheel, okay? Of course, Aristotle is the philosopher, and these guys are just running off Aristotle. So here's Aristotle. One can signify even things that are not Aristotle, okay? Or he says, indeed, we can also think of things that in no ways are, such as a hypocenter and a chimera. So this is the philosopher, right? And these guys are good Aristotelians. They're just articulating the Aristotelian thoughts. So the sort of standard view of formal logic in the 14th century is syllogistic. And most of you, I'm sure, will know sort of basically what syllogistic is. There are essentially four forms. S and P are subject and predicate. We now call them predicates or categories or something like this. All men are mortal, no men are mortal, some men are mortal, and some men are not mortal. So those are the four syllogistic forms. And I'm going to concentrate on this one, okay? But similar comments apply to all of them. So we're going to be looking at the I form. All right. And the question is, if you've got an I statement, some S of P, what are its truth conditions? So, of course, people in the 14th century did not talk about truth conditions. Their theory was a theory of supposition, which is a theory of reference. But effectively, what these guys were doing were giving truth conditions for particular sentences with a particular quantifier, some. So, what are the truth conditions of some S of P if you're in the 14th century? Well, they're this. What is it for some S's P to be true? Well, it's a disjunction. It's a disjunction. And it's of the form, whoa, okay, S1 is P, S2 is P, S3 is P, and so on, where S1, S2, and so on is an enumeration of all the S's that exist. Okay, nothing very exciting there. The logicians describe this as determinate supposition, but never mind the jargon. This is what it comes to. So far, so good. But the is we take seriously as tensed. So the is there is present. The verb is tensed and can be qualified. So what about future and past tenses? Well, okay, what about some S will be P or some S was P? Okay, let's do this one. Some S will be P. The past tense one is symmetrical. Okay, so what is it for to be, when is some S will be P true? Well, that's true just if S1 will be P or S2 will be P or. And what are the S's this time? Well, S1, S2 now is an enumeration of all the things that exist or will exist. Okay. So some man will be dead. that some man could be a man who exists now or a man who exists in the future. Okay, that's why you need the enumeration to enumerate over things that now exist or will exist. And the medievals had a very robust sense of existence. To exist is to exist now. Okay, so this enumeration enumerates also things that do not exist, although they will exist. And the fact that you've kind of expanded your enumeration to things that will exist is called ampliation. So this is the doctrine of ampliation. In modern terms, what you would say is that with a future tense sentence, the domain of quantification is ampliated to include not just present things, but future things. So already we have an appeal to non-existent objects. Okay, but we've only just started. So here we are qualifying the copula with a tense, but there are other ways to qualify the copula. You can do it with a modal verb. So what about some S could be P? All right. Well, what are the truth conditions of that? Well, you've got a further case of ampliation. So no prizes for guessing. What are the truth conditions of this? Well, it's S1 could be P or S2 could be P or, and what are the S's this time? Well, they're an enumeration of all the things that are or could be S. So here we ampliate, not just to present objects, but to possible objects. And the medievals are very clear that some of these are merely possible objects. So these are objects which do not actually exist. Okay, and they're well aware of what they're doing. Okay, so here is Jean Bourdon, one of the great medieval logicians. A term put before the word can is ampliated to stand for possible things, even if they do not and did not exist. Therefore, the proposition a golden mountain can be as large as Mont Ventoux is true because you've ampliated to a possible object. Okay, and it's just commonplace in 14th century for logicians to talk about non-existent objects. Okay, so here is Paul of Venice. The absence of the signification of a term from reality does not prevent the term suppositing, i.e. referring to it. Okay, and I mean, Paul is not out on Olympia. This is standard. Okay. But we ain't finished because ampliation is kind of a bit more interesting than that. Because ampliation also works for intensional verbs. So intensional verbs are verbs of mental state which have an object. Okay, so I fear the Antichrist. I understand the Antichrist. I imagine the Antichrist. I'm thinking of the Antichrist. So all these are intensional verbs. And the object is the Antichrist, which of course in the 14th century does not exist. The guy's thinking it will exist. Okay, but the point is that you've got an intensional verb here. These things are true. Okay, so I thought George Reuben feared the Antichrist. That's true. What is one to say? So here, I mean, it can't be true unless the Antichrist refers to something. So you've got to ampliate beyond the present. How wide do you ampliate? Is it merely past and future things? Is it possible things? Well, here's Marsilius of Ingham, not such a well-known medieval logician, but very influential in his time. Ampliation is the supposition of a term for its significance, which are or were, for those which are or will be, for those which are or can be, or for those which are or can be imagined. Note the extra clause. So, what kinds of things can be imagined? Obviously, you can imagine lots of things which don't exist, but can you imagine impossibilia? This is a topic on which medieval philosophers and logicians disagree. But let's just think a bit about chimeras. So chimera, you'll be familiar with, I guess. A chimera, you normally think of it as a mythical animal with body parts of different animals, maybe the tail of a serpent, the body of I don't know, an eagle and the head of a lion or something like this. Obviously, chimeras don't exist, but a chimera is a stock medieval example of an impossible object, not merely a non-existent, an impossible object. Why is that? Because a chimera, as the 14th century people understood it, was something not with just different body parts, but with more than one essence. Okay, so a chimera would have the essence of a snake, the essence of an eagle, and the essence of a lion, say. And these guys are good Aristotelians. So something can have only one essence. So chimera is an impossible object, metaphysically impossible, because it has three essences which are incompatible. Okay, so as I say, you don't have to agree with this, but I'm just pointing out that a chimera is a standard medieval example of an impossible object. So, can you imagine a chimera? Well, some guys think no. So here's Buridan again. Every term which supposits refers, supposits for that which is or can be, or will be, or has been, but it's impossible that a chimera can be, or can have been, or can come to be. Hence, a chimera is thinkable, is false. So there's the intentional verb. The subject in this doubt is putting the passive, but it's an intentional verb. And the noun phrase, a chimera, does not refer to anything, because you cannot refer to impossible objects. Okay. So here's his Buridan on the matter. He doesn't think you can that ampliation extends to impossibilia. But here's Paul of Venice, who's just as significant a philosopher. Although the significatum of the term chimera does not and could not exist in reality, still the term chimera supposits for something in the proposition a chimera is thought of, since it supposits for, guess what, a chimera. So, you know, Paul and John disagree. One thinks that you can ampliate to impossibilia, one doesn't. Okay, so this is a controversy in the 14th century. And Paul is not alone in his view that you can ampliate to impossibilia. Here's a quotation from a slightly later philosopher, century and a half later, Francisco Suarez. The imagination is the same as fantasy, with the sole addition of the power of composing sensibilia, fabricating impossibilia. Fantasy here, I'm not entirely sure what he means, but I think he means when you fantasize. So I fantasize about Donald Trump being taken down to hell, like the end of Don Giovanni, you know, for all the wicked things he's done. That's a fantasy I have, and it's about a real life object, unfortunately, Donald Trump. Okay, but you know, this is not an impossibility. Donald Trump is all too possible, and being dragged down to hell, well, you know, maybe that's possible too. But imagination is when you imagine something impossible. So I imagine something with the legs of Donald Trump, the body of Ivanka Trump, and the head of Joe Biden. Kind of chimera. All right. Okay. So there are certainly a number of medieval logicians who think that ampliation extends to imagined objects, which may be more than possibilia. They may be impossibilia as well. All right. So that's the end of the first part of the talk. Now let's talk a little bit about the properties of non-existent objects. So the medievals contributed something to this debate, but there are some things they're silent about. So let's just think about this for a minute. The Antichrist is a liar. Now that's false. This is actually, there's a reference to the Antichrist in the Bible. I'll give you the reference if you want to know, but I think it's Paul who talks about the Antichrist in one of his epistles. But the Antichrist is a lie is false because remember, this is significantly tensed, and the Antichrist is something that does not exist in the 14th century. So this is false. However, all these guys think it will be true when the Antichrist does exist. I'm tempted to make a remark about Donald Trump again, but you can think about that. Okay. So in the future, when the Antichrist exists, the now phrase, the Antichrist, will refer to that thing, and that the Antichrist will be a liar, because that's what the Bible says. Okay. So where does so it's a property of the Antichrist to be a liar. Where does the Antichrist, or maybe when does the Antichrist have the property of being a liar? Well, not now, but in the future. Okay? Similarly, for the past, Socrates is in Athens is false. I mean, if you go to Athens nowadays, you're not going to find Socrates, right? So when does Socrates have the property of being in Athens? No prizes. In the 4th century BCE? 5th century? 5th century, isn't it? Anyway, whichever it was. If you go back to the time when Socrates existed, then Socrates in Athens is true then. Okay, so if you're dealing with tense and you're dealing with objects that do not exist but will exist or did exist, then the objects have their properties at the future time or the past time. Okay? So temporal ampliation was the first category that we talked about. What about modal ampliation? So where does a merely possible object have its properties? So let's take a merely possible object, such as my third child. Okay, I only have two, but I could have had a third had I been, had I wanted one. Okay, so where does my third child have the property of being my third child? Well, in this world, for sure. This, as far as I know, is not something that the medievals talked about. Maybe they did, and my scholarship is just not up to it, but as far as I know, they didn't. But there's an obvious similarity between time and modality, which many, many people have observed. So if you take the temporal solution and just apply it to modality, you get an obvious answer, namely that my third child has the property of being my third child, not in the past or the future, but in a possible world, not just a time, but a possible world where I do have a third child. Okay, so this is a view that's sometimes called modal monogenism. I don't like the term monogenism for reasons I've already explained, but if you just do the analogy with the temporal case, then a possible object is going to have its characterizing properties at a possible world. All right. Vulcan, I'm not talking about the Greek god, Roman god here. I'm talking about the planet postulated by scientists in the 19th century to explain the precession of the perihelion of Mercury. It's a submercurial planet whose gravitational field makes the orbit of Mercury rotate. So Vulcan is the closest planet to the Sun. Well, that's not true. But it's true in a world in which the 19th century astronomers got it right. Similarly, Anna Karenina does not have the property of jumping under a train in this world, but she has it in those worlds which realize the Tolstoy stories. Okay, so these are possible worlds, I take it. Now, so far so good. What about impossible objects? Well, if merely possible objects have their properties at possible worlds, where do impossible objects have their properties? Okay, no prizes at impossible worlds. Okay, so look, consider this. I'm imagining a round square pearl deep in a trench of the Pacific Ocean. That's true. Think about it. You can do it. Okay, you can't picture it, but there are lots of merely possible things you cannot visually picture. A Chiliagan, is that how you pronounce it? That's a sort of thousand-sided figure. You can't visually picture a Chiliagan, but it's quite possible, okay? Imagination is not restricted to visual or even sensory imagination. I mean, we use imagination all the time in mathematics, and the things we're imagining are not sensory objects. I imagine a proof of Goldbach's conjecture. Okay, so we don't know whether Goldbach's conjecture is true or false. One of them's got to be false. One of them's got to be impossible, assuming that mathematical non-existent things are impossible things. You can imagine a proof of Goldbach's conjecture and the negation of Goldbach's conjecture. One of those is impossible. Okay, obviously this is not sensory imagination because we're not visualizing a token, we're visualizing a type, which is an abstract object. Or okay, some of you may know this. I wrote a short story many years ago called Sylvan's Box, which is about, well, it's about Richard Sylvan in the first instance, although he's dead. And it's about what happens after he dies. And there are two characters who are alive in the play. One is myself, one is Richard's literary executor, Nick Griffin. And we actually find a box amongst Richard's possessions, which is an impossible object. It's a box that's both full and empty. Okay. If you don't know the story, I like it. Read the story. And so you read the story, and you will imagine me and Nick finding this contradictory object. Okay, believe me. So you can certainly imagine impossible things. Where does the round square pearl deep in a trench of the Pacific Ocean have its properties, that it is being a round square pearl, etc., etc.? Well, in the impossible world where there is such a pearl, where did Nick and Graham find Sylvan's box? Well, in an impossible world, there is this contradictory box. So, where do impossible objects have their impossible properties? Not at this world, because this is not an impossible world. They have them at impossible worlds. All right. So this is the end of the second part of the talk. What we've done so far is look at the grounds that the medievals had, supposing that some things don't exist. And I've sort of extrapolated a little bit already to contemporary debates by talking about where non-existent objects have their characterizing properties. And as you've seen, the medievals answered that in the case of temporal non-existence, but possible and impossible non-existent objects, I don't think they have much to say about that. So I've extrapolated, but when you extrapolate, you get, the view that I've described, which is modal mononism, nullism. All right, so we've had a look at the grounds that the medievals had for supposing that some things don't exist. Now let's talk about how those grounds stand up in the contemporary scenario. So cast your mind back. What were the medieval grounds? Well, there were three, okay? One concerned time, one concerned possibility, and one concerned intentionality. Primarily, I mean, we discussed imagination, but it goes for the other intentional verbs as well. So let's think about those three cases and what one might say about them in contemporary terms. So let's start with time. So the medievals had a very robust sense of existence. They thought that to exist is to exist now. And some contemporary nullists have held this view, like Richard Sylvan did, for example. I don't find this personally such a persuasive view, for the simple reason that you might think of exists in a tenseless sense, or at least a trans-temporal sense. So to exist in a tenseless sense is to exist to have existed or to be going to exist, right? So if you think about existence in this tenseless sense, which is kind of natural, then future and past objects do exist in this tenseless sense. So at least if you understand exists in this way, it's not a good example of non-existent objects. And I find that kind of reasonably persuasive. So this is something I disagree with Richard about. So I think, anyway, how you avoid this medieval example, it's relatively straightforward. But let's move on to possibility. Okay. So consider the claim that Homer doesn't exist. Well, I'm not sure exactly what contemporary scholarship says, but I think it's kind of dubious that Homer existed. And if you don't like Homer, try Abraham or Lao Tzu or something else that modern scholarship tends to cast doubt on. So let's just stick with Homer. Homer didn't exist, but he could have done, epistemically, metaphysically, physically, I guess. So Homer doesn't exist. That's true. So it looks as though we're talking about a merely possible object when we say that Homer doesn't exist. Now, if you are not a nonist, there is an easy way out of this, and that is to use a negative free logic. So if you're a negative free logician, subject-predicate sentences where the subject does not refer are going to be false. Okay. So Father Christmas wears a red suit is false. But because they're false, their negations are going to be true. So if H, Homer, is a name that doesn't refer to anything, then Homer exists is going to be false, and so its negation is going to be true. So if you run that line, then you can sort of get out of this particular argument for non-existence appealing to merely possible objects. But there are more complicated examples where you can't do this. So look, okay. Actually, see, I've forgotten I was going to say something about this. Yeah, if you're a negative free logician, you can get out of this category, this example for non-existent objects, but it's harder to get out of the claim that it's possible that Homer existed, because, hey, for this to be true, Homer exists has got to be true at some possible world. So at that possible world, the noun phrase Homer does refer, okay, and it refers to something that does not exist at this world. So one way or another, you're committed to the word Homer referring to something. Okay. So this is harder for a non-nonist to cope with, but there are even harder things for a non-nonist to cope with, because just consider this claim: there might have been more things than there actually are. That seems true. You know, there could have been one more electron in the cosmos. That seems true. Look, how you express this in a formal language, there are actually several ways of doing it, but I've just written it like this. So E is the existence predicate, as before. So this is a set of things that exist. At here is an actuality operator. So you can read this as actually. So the set of things that exist properly contains the set of things that actually exist. So this is one way you can express the claim that there might have been more things than there actually are. Okay, it's not the only way, but that'll do. If you think that's true, there might be more things than there are. Then obviously, you've got a set of things here on the left-hand side, which contains non-existent objects. So once you start making modal sentences of this kind, you seem to be committed to non-existent objects. So we looked at two of the medieval examples, time, modality, and I think the modality is a much more plausible argument for non-existent objects. In fact, I'm inclined to believe it. Okay, so all right. So what about the third one? So the third one, remember, was intentionality. So I'm thinking of Donald Trump. Unfortunately, I still do in my nightmares. The only good thing about the Ukrainian war is that it's driven Donald Trump off the front pages of the New York Times, and most papers for that matter. I'm thinking of Homer. Okay, so here I'm thinking of an existent object. Here I'm thinking of a non-existent object. I'm thinking of Sylvia's box. Here I'm thinking of an impossible object. All these things can be true. And the question is, what is the obvious parsing of these sentences is subject-predicate form. Can I put that down? Yeah. Okay. So the obvious form of these things and any other sentence with an intentional verb is of the form ARB. And if it has that logical form, of course, A exists. If you think of something, then you exist. But the B may not do. It may be an impossible object. So the nonist account of intentionality says, well, this is the common sense parsing of these things, and it's right. The second thing may or may not exist, but hey, that's a good common sense view. No, Father Christmas doesn't exist. So if you're going to reject this argument, what can you say? Well, look, if you know the literature, you'll know that there are lots of things that have been said, and this is not the place for me to review all the things that have been said. We can talk about any of them that you want to talk about in the discussion, but let me just sort of map out the basic possibilities. So one thing you might say is that thinking of B is a single semantic unit. This is something that some philosophers have said. So you have to think of thinking of Donald Trump as a monadic predicate. Okay. Look, there are various worries you might have, but one of the obvious ones is quantifying in. So I'm thinking of Donald Trump, therefore I'm thinking of something. All right. So if you're a nonist, this has a very simple logical form. The fractor S here is my way of writing the particular quantifier. All right. So one quantifier in modern logic is the universal quantifier. The other one, what's the dual of universal? Particular, okay? Calling it the existential quantifier is already loading the dice. So, but if you see a backwards E written, every logician has this knee-jerk reaction to say there exists, and I have it too, okay? So I try to avoid the backwards E when I really want to insist that I'm talking about the particular quantifier, i.e. sum. Okay, so the fractor S is just sum. Sum X is such that A are X. So sum X is such that I'm thinking about it. And this is obviously valid inference just by particular quantification. Now, if you think that this thinking of B, is a single semantic unit, you cannot quantify into it because the name Donald Trump does not actually refer to anything. It's just part of the whole predicate. Okay, so that's one of the problems that this move faces, but it's a move that's been made. What other possibilities are there? Well, I think this is probably the most common one that you meet if you talk to non-logicians. If you're thinking about a non-existent object, you're not thinking about it, but you're thinking about a representation of it. I mean, I'm inclined to think this is a wacky view. I mean, you can think about a representation. I can think about London. I can think about a representation of London. But London is not a representation of London. Well, at least many representations of London are not London. Similarly, I can think of Sherlock Holmes, and I can think of a representation of Sherlock Holmes. These are not the same thing. And if I'm thinking of Sherlock Holmes, I'm thinking of Sherlock Holmes. I'm not thinking of representation of Sherlock Holmes. Maybe if I'm thinking of Sherlock Holmes, then a representation of Sherlock Holmes comes between my ears, whatever that means. That's fine. That's what it is to think of Sherlock Holmes. But even though in thinking of Sherlock Holmes, a representation of Sherlock Holmes comes into my mind or between my ears, I'm thinking of the thing represented, just as I'm thinking of London. If in thinking of London, a representation of London comes through my mind. Okay, so I don't find this a particularly plausible move. However, it obviously has problems because, well, here's one. Something I'm thinking of is a past president of the US and a truly terrible person. Okay, that's true, right? So in canonical notation, it's got to be something like this. What is the quantifier over here? Things like this make no sense if you think of Donald Trump, right? Yet I have absolutely no doubt that Ivanka Trump's representation of Donald Trump is very different from mine. So you can't simply say, what does that mean? Well, there's some representation such that I relate to it and Ivanka Trump relates to it because we have different representations of Donald Trump. So this doesn't work either. Okay, so as I said, there are various moves you can make at this point. We can talk about them in discussion if you want, but I find these pretty persuasive objections. So we've considered two possible ways of doing the non-common sense thing. One was to treat the predicate as a single block. One was to say, well, it's not a single block, but the object term refers to a representation. Third and final move that you might make is that you can take the object term to refer to some other kind of existent entity. So mental representations are one kind of existent entity, but some people have suggested that the object term refers not to a mental representation, but to some other kind of existent entity. So you're probably familiar with the fact that in the literature, some people think that fictional names like Sherlock Holmes refer to abstract objects, existent abstract objects. They're kind of Platonists about abstract objects. So a third possibility is to take the object term to refer to something other than a representation, but nonetheless something that exists. Maybe an abstract fictional entity. Maybe abstract objects can be actually created by sort of writing fictions. I mean, that's a standard possibility. So what does one want to say about this? Well, look, if I'm thinking, I can think about something that doesn't exist. So suppose I'm thinking of Sherlock Holmes, then I'm thinking about something that doesn't exist. If I'm thinking about God, then I'm thinking about something that doesn't exist. Okay, you think that too. Okay, even if you're a Christian, there are lots of gods that you can think about that don't exist, right? Yahweh, Brahman, Zeus, take your pick. So it's clear that you can think about things that don't exist. In fact, changing your mind about what exists can be highly significant. I mean, when I was a kid, I was a Christian, right? And then I became an atheist. So I changed my mind about the existence of a Christian God, and it was highly significant in my life. So moving from thinking that something exists to that something doesn't exist really can be, very important in people's lives. Okay, so if you're thinking about something that doesn't exist, well, the natural way of writing it is like this. So if you think that the object of an intensional state is an existent object, this cannot possibly be right. Because if you're thinking about something and that something is an existent object, maybe an abstract object, then of course it does exist, albeit as an abstract object. So again, there are moves you might make at this point. We can talk about those if you want, but I find this kind of consideration pretty persuasive. All right. So we've now reviewed the 3 medieval reasons for supposing the non-existent objects, and I find at least 2 of them pretty persuasive. I'm not saying that the medieval reasons are the only reasons, I don't think that's true, but I think it's quite useful to sort of go back and have this historical perspective. Let me conclude. Okay, I found this course on the net. I think it's real. I don't think it's a put up. I think it's kind of curious. I mean, I like the rabbit here holding a scimitar, right? But the most interesting thing is this knight, okay, who's cutting off the head of a chimera. But the head looks like the head of a kangaroo. I don't think the medievals knew about kangaroos. The medieval Europeans, of course, the medieval native Australians knew about kangaroos. Okay, so I like the picture anyway. So where have we been? Well, we started by looking at the history of logic, and I explained why the medieval logicians held that there are some things that don't exist. They involved tense, they involved modality, and they involved intentionality. Of course, we don't exactly believe the medieval theory of supposition now, but that's okay. We believe some more things. We then had a brief interlude where I talked about what one is to make about where or when or whatever non-existent things have their non-existent properties. Well, that's not a good way of putting it, where non-existent things have their characterizing properties. And we saw that the medievals have a solution to that in the case of time. As far as I know, they don't address it in the other cases, but you can extrapolate and you get something like modal nonism. And then in the third part of the talk, we looked at the 3 reasons that the medievals have, supposing that some things don't exist: temporal, modal, and intentional. And what I argued was that, at least prima facie, the modal arguments and the intentional arguments still look pretty good. So, medieval logic was a great time in the history of logic. These guys were fabulous logicians. It was the most exciting and creative and precise epoch of logic, really, until the end of the 19th century. So anyway, if this talk does nothing else, I hope it will sort of kick off a discussion that we're going to have in the next 2 days about arguments for nonism. So thank you very much for your time and your concentration, and I look forward to the discussion now and for the rest of the 2 days. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So I think all the conferences were where they actually first had the speakers here and then later the speakers in the online. I think we could do it so in one talk this way and in the other talk the other way. And I think in this talk we start with the audience here. So the first one I saw was Alberto, then Leah, Niall, Lee. Go ahead, Alberto. And then Maria, you had also quite no. It was sorry, well, that was the hand. Okay, yeah, Roberto, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, Graham. It's very hard to disagree with you for
Excellent. You'll do your best.
more or less, be very creative in order to disagree with you about something. But my only perplexity, we have already discussed about that, is the intentionality argument. For one might say, well, look, there are other cases in which one might say that we have intentional objects. But in those cases, we would not be tempted by saying that there is something that we are thinking about in a sort of substantive sense. For instance, in the generic use, if somebody in the famous Quinian example wishes for a sloop, even though she doesn't wish for any particular sloop whatsoever, one would say, well, in a sense, there is an intentional object even there, for there is something upon which one thought is directed. But since it is a generic item, we don't like generic items in our ontological inventory, so to speak, and so we don't want to be committed to these kind of things. So why in the case that you have pointed out, the situation is different? It is true that in your cases, as you said, there is the problem of accounting for the validity of a certain inference, which does not exist in the other cases. But still one might say, well, I agree that there is an inference that is valid. If I think about Homer, then there is something on which I'm thinking of, but maybe I can paraphrase the quantified sentence.
Yeah. No, good. I take the point. Look, the sort of situation that you're calling generic, I'd rather say that a sloop is a quantified phrase. Okay, generics I tend to think of as other things like the whale. But you're right. That when you say I want a sloop, the object term is a quantified phrase, and you can have I want every sloop, I want some sloops, whatever. But those are interesting cases, and I'll say just two things. The first is the examples I had. The object, the grammatical object, is a noun, is a name, a rigid designator, not a quantified phrase. Okay, so you said, well, what's the difference between this case and that case? Well, that's one difference. Okay. But that leaves the question of what to say about the case where you've got a description, a quantified phrase as the object. There's a discussion of that in Towards Non-Being, as you probably remember. And what I suggest there is that you really have to understand those cases as reducible to cases where the thing after the intentional verb is a proposition, a statement, a sentence, not a noun phrase. That's contentious, but that's what I'd be inclined to say. Okay, so you have to understand I want a sloop as I want it to be the case that I possess some sloop, or I do something else with a sloop. So, I mean, that's where that particular discussion will go.
Thanks. Niall?
Thanks. I have lots of questions, but I'll keep it to one for now. And
yeah, we have 2 days to discuss.
Yeah. And I agree anyway. I want to ask about impossible worlds. So in the debate about possible worlds between Lewis and other people, I guess most people fall into one of 2 camps. Either these things are on the same standing as this world, ontologically speaking, or there's some sort of representation.
Yes.
So I was wondering where you would fall on that, because you know the reasons why certain combinations of properties can't be instantiated in this world, if these other things or items like this world on the same standing, then those would be reasons why a chimera can't exist in one of those worlds as well, or doesn't exist.
Yeah.
You modality output. So I think there are problems with saying that impossible worlds are ontologically on the same standing with this world.
Mhm.
which leaves the option that they're representations of some sort, which doesn't mean that the things that they contain can't be thought about and can't be quantified over. I'm completely on board with that. I'm just wondering, would you be comfortable saying that in possible worlds, that's just another way of talking about how non-existent objects are represented?
Yeah. Good. That's a very interesting issue. In principle, I think you can go either way. You could be a Lewisian about impossible worlds. You could be a Swanakarian about impossible worlds. Or that there's a hybrid view. You could think of possible worlds as having one kind of status and impossible worlds having a different kind of status. And you can find people who endorse all those three views out in the literature. But you asked about my view, okay? I'll tell you what it is. I'm not quite sure how it fits into your taxonomy, but you can tell me. There's one world which is privileged. This one. This world is a concrete object, okay? It exists and it's unique for better or for worse. Okay. All worlds other than the actual are simply non-existent objects. So all worlds other than the actual, be they possible or impossible, are non-existent objects. And so their status is uniform.
So, are we allowed to follow up or?
Sure.
So, in this world, a horse can't have wings.
In this world, horses don't have wings.
Yeah, horses don't. So yeah, so
Now, what's going to happen 100 years down the
yeah,
track?
so horses
There may
don't-
well be wings
sure,
horses,
so
right?
horses. But there were some combinations of properties that were just ruled out from this world because
Let's say being red all over and being green all over.
yeah, that combinations of properties precludes something from
Okay.
existing that
Okay.
has that. So I guess my worry is, what is it about these other worlds that, you know, as I see it, that's something about those properties and existence.
Yep.
So you want to say that there is an impossible world in which there is something that is red and green all over.
I want to say that some worlds are impossible, and in some of those worlds, some things are, let's say, red all over and green all over.
So that combination of properties,
Can be realized, but can be realized only in the impossible world, because it's impossible, in virtually any sense of possible, that something is red all over and green all over.
This is what I'm struggling with, but let's continue. I won't hold it up too long now. I'll get back to it.
Well, look, I don't know quite what we're worrying about here. We agree that it's impossible that something is red all over and green all over. So there's no possible world in which something is red all over and green all over. But I can imagine something that's red all over and green all over. I can't visualize it, I can imagine it. So the thing I'm imagining, in some sense, it has those properties, because I'm not thinking about Donald Trump, I'm thinking about something that's red all over and green all over. Where does the thing have its properties? Well, obviously not in the possible world.
But it
I think
doesn't.
possible.
Redness all over precludes greenness all over.
Yeah, but think about what you're saying. What
I'm saying I
precludes?
represent it as being red all over and green all over.
Correct. But
So
what
it
you're
has those properties according to a representation. That's the sense in which it has them.
well, I don't. Look, okay, maybe this brings us back to where we started, or whether we think of worlds as representations. I don't. Okay, but when you say something can't be red all over and green all over, one precludes the other. What you're saying, in effect, is that it's impossible that something is like that, and I agree with you. That's why the thing cannot have those properties in a possible world. Right? Okay, look, I don't know where the disagreement goes at this point.
Yeah, let me think about it.
Yeah.
Thanks. Lee? Thanks, Brian. I had two kind of clarification questions about medievals, of whom I know So the first one was if they want to endorse non-existence, how do they say some things don't exist? Because the enumeration for some SSP enumerated over the existing things. So I wondered if they could say that, or if they had to do something else, or they just didn't want to affirm that. They kind of showed things didn't exist without saying it, or something like that.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. Look, you'd have to ask a real medievalist what they actually said about this. I can only speculate. We don't have a blackboard, do we? Oh my goodness. Okay. So the obvious part of that is it's not the case that some things exist. So that's got to be true,
Yeah.
and that's got to be false. And it should come out as true, right? So that's the worry. Good. So if I were medieval, what would I say about this? Well, I'd have to say that there's some kind of ampliation going on. So it kind of looks as though, you know, this can ampliate. So that this, let's put it in modern terms, this quantifier can ampliate, can range over past and possible things. I've never seen that in a medieval text. That's what I think you'd have to say. But it's a good question. I'll have to ask people who are actually medievalists about this. I mean, how you handle it in modern logic is obvious, right? So this is specifically a problem about the medieval account. So that's all I can say in answer to the question.
Can I have a second question? It's kind of related to this. So it's about scope.
Sure.
So they're talking about the analogy between the temporal and the modal cases. And well, I guess the question is, did they distinguish between the will or the could taking narrow scope versus it taking wide scope over the quantifier? Did they have those tools? And did they just think they were equivalent, or
no? No. I don't know. I don't know any texts that discuss the temporal case, but I assume there are some in this case. There's certainly lots of things about the modal distinction, and they distinguish between two senses of modality. The medieval terms, in senso diviso and in senso collectivum, or something like that. So the distinction has sort of come down to us in different terminology as de re and de dicto.
Yeah.
Okay, but speaking, the modal logicians are going to say if A must be B, you could mean two different things. One is, as we now put it, narrow scope. One is broad scope. There wasn't universal agreement about how you cut the cake. This is one of the medieval debates, but certainly they were very familiar with this distinction.
Yeah, because the enumeration you get, you've got like very natural for the narrow scope. I don't know, just if you didn't, you might think it's only the wide scope sentences that are true. So it could be that some man is something that no man is. But maybe no actual man could be that way. So it's not true that some man could have been there.
Right. Let me see if I get this thought right. I mean, this example does not involve modality.
Yeah.
Are you suggesting that we can apply this sort of modal thought to this example?
No, it's more. So when we had the in the modal enumeration, that some S could be P.
Sure.
And then it was like S1 is P, or S2 is P, where the S1's ranged over all the possibilities.
Sure.
I was thinking, well, if we're treating that English sentence, pseudo-English sentence, that some S could be P as having the modal has narrow scope, then that enumeration looks correct.
Yeah.
But if the modal had wide scope, that enumeration isn't obviously correct.
Correct. That's right. So, so the distinction of drawing is possible that some things are and some things are possible, right?
Yeah.
Where the modal operator is qualifying the predicate. And what I was talking about was this case.
Oh, okay.
How do you handle this case? Again, look, I'm not familiar enough with the medieval discussions to answer that question. As I said, they're familiar with the distinction, but you'd have to take this as, in some sense, operating on the
That's
P's
interesting.
to ampliate the extension of that, whereas this thing is going to be simply of this form. So this will be a way of saying some actual things have the property of being possibly P. I mean, that's an obvious enough move that my guess is that that's what they said, but I'm not enough for medieval to know whether they did say that.
No, that's fine. That clears up a misunderstanding I had.
Yeah.
Any other question from the audience? Is there anyone in our virtual audience that wants to ask a question? Yeah, also I had also this thing with this, some things do not exist. So one option that one has, also if one more contemporarily thinks about thing, one could have the thing that the thing is ambiguous, the expression thing, and in other sense, everything somewhere in some world also. So as we use the word thing, it has this more narrow use and it has this wider use as something in any sense. So, and if you from a contemporary perspective think that the quantifier adapt to what is said by the predicates, it would easy then to ampliate this on this basis. But as the second point showed, it's not so easy for the medieval because they seem to have only this option where so the whole sentence is then ampliated. So, but you could formulate this medieval position in a more modern logical setting, and then you have the option with this derived distinction. Nevertheless, the idea that the quantifiers adapt, whether you're talking about the presence, the future or so, and then the domain also changes on this basis. And then you could also solve this case. But nevertheless, you have a reading where this is false. And I think do you think there is on your account a reading where it is false? Some things do not exist.
Okay, so let's think about the contemporary case first, then we'll talk about the medieval case. Look, in English and all natural languages, when we use quantifiers, the domain is almost always contextually bounded. I don't think that's always true. I think you can make absolutely universal quantified sentences, because some people disagree with that. But what's clear is that when we use some, all, or none in the normally, we have some things of a certain kind in mind. Okay. There's nothing in the fridge. It doesn't mean there's a vacuum in the fridge. It means there's no food in the fridge, right? So quantifiers change their domain according to the context normally. That's fine. And so some things don't exist. I mean, if your quantifier is restricted to existing things, that's obviously false.
Yep.
If it's if it includes non-existent objects, it's true. So that's right. So I take that point. What are the medievals going to say about this? Well, again, my knowledge of medieval logic is not sufficient to say what they actually did say. But I presume they were familiar with the fact that in the vernacular, the domain of quantifiers is contextually determined. So if they say that, then of course they're not going to put it in those terms, but there's certainly scope for saying that some things don't exist. The sum there kind of gets aggregated to, well, the sum there is going to range over a certain kind of domain. And maybe, like this way, at that point, I have to leave the discussion to a medievalist.
Yeah, but so an easy fix would be just to say some thinkable things do not exist. Then you could express it, and then you have to spell out what is meant by thinkable. There's someone who thinks about something.
Good.
Then we could also do it with the narrow scope.
Yeah, no, that's true. So if you take the domain to be indicated by a predicate in modern terms, some x's don't exist, then you might say some x's don't exist. So if you take the S here to be thing, object, objects, including fictional objects and so on, then you will have to spell this out where the sum is an enumeration of the S's. So maybe that's the most sensible way to go, in fact, just to take the subject to be, or the domain of quantification to be indicated by a subject whose extension includes non-existent objects. Actually, that's more sensible than thinking about its negation than MPS. Yeah, actually, that's a much better solution.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I've seen there were other questions. Who was first of Andrea?
No,
or,
Andrea Raimondi was first.
Yeah, Andrea,
Okay,
you next.
okay. Thanks. Thanks for the talk. That was very, very interesting. I learned many things about medieval logic. So I have this question, which is a sort of clarificatory question, but maybe not only. I saw that you translated the existence predicate of English always in the same way.
Yeah.
That is the impression I had from your discussion. But my question is it really a unified phenomenon, or did they really think that it was a unified phenomenon? I was thinking of the last problem you say the thing that does not exist, namely Sherlock Holmes. I'm saying something and yet there is a clearly correct sense in which what I'm saying is true. So first, is this the problem you were discussing? And if it is, then I think it rests on the idea that there is only one meaning for exists.
Okay, Andrea, the line's not great, and I missed half what you said. It's about the existence of Sherlock Holmes. Can you say this again? I'm sorry, I just off the question.
Yeah, sorry. So I was saying, let's get back to your example. I'm thinking of a thing that does not
Exist.
exist. In the context of the discussion of the view that the name refers to a fictional character, an abstract entity of some sort. That was the last view you discussed. And my question is whether you could say something more about this example, because I don't see really a problem with the view that the name here refers to an abstract entity. For one could that we want to say that Sherlock Holmes does exist as a perhaps when we say that it does not exist, we mean simply it doesn't have a spatial existence, concrete existence, is not part of the concrete world or something like that. To deny Sherlock Holmes. And indeed, on the view at stake, we acknowledge that it does exist as an abstract entity. Contrast this case, for example, with the case where a nominalist about mathematical objects says, I'm thinking about something that does not exist, namely the number 2. In this case, so I guess my question is there just one sense of existence, or are there many senses, and these many senses could account for these cases?
Okay, good. So I've got the question now. Look, yeah, that's very nice. Okay. Several things. First of all, you can use the word to mean anything you like. Okay? And if you want to use the word exist to mean object, well, just say what you mean. And if that's what you mean by exist, then obviously all objects exist. Okay, because all objects are objects. And I'm not. I certainly wouldn't want to claim that there's uniquely right meaning to the word exist. Just say what you mean, and let's talk about that. When I say God doesn't exist, when I became an atheist, I didn't mean that I changed my mind to thinking that God was not a concrete object. I never thought that God was a concrete object, right? So at least in many cases where we think that something doesn't exist, we don't change from moving its status from concrete to abstract or vice versa. It's a kind of categorical thing. So there seem to be many sort of very ordinary examples where you wouldn't want to sort of just think about a change from being abstract to being concrete or vice versa.
Yeah, I agree with that. In the case of God, I think I agree. But still, like, let's not focus on a particular example. A unified meaning for the word exist, as in the case of God, and apply it to all the cases, or how we're happy to say we should discuss it on a case-by-case criterion, right? So the case of God, the case of Sherlock Holmes might be one word for all of these, exist and doesn't exist. But this doesn't really show to me that the topic is the same and the treatment should be the same, right?
Look, as I say, you can use the word exist to mean anything you like. I mean, you can use it to mean is a concrete object, is an abstract object, or I guess if you wanted to go down that path, I'd be inclined to say that exist was univocal, but you can modify it. Exist concretely, exist abstractly. And if you think that some things exist abstractly, you can make that move. I mean, actually, that's Meinong's view. Okay, Meinong thought that abstract objects exist. He uses the Beschwen. So, and this is certainly a possible move. Okay, my own view is, I think existence is a highly problematic word. Just tell us what you mean by it, and let's talk about that. Okay, but I agree. You can articulate it in the way you did. Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
So Maria is now.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that instructive talk. I've learned a lot about medievals. It was nice. I would like to comment on your example about your possible third child. You started with the medieval treatment of past and future tense sentences. So, and the medieval said Socrates is in essence is a fourth sentence, but it was true when Socrates existed. I think that is a nice view. And then you tried to present as a sort of analogy the ampliation to possible objects with this example about your third child. And you said priest third child, or Graham's third child is priest third child is true in some possible world. And it strikes me that this is not a real analogy to the medieval treatment of past and future sentences. I think that the real analogy would rather something like follows. Priest's third child is priest's third child would be true if the child existed. So I think the real analogy would not involve reference to possible worlds. Would you agree?
Okay, so we're talking about two different analogies, and what you said is this is yours is the real analogy. Okay.
Yes, I would say it is the direct, or it is closer to the medieval treatment of past and future tense sentences.
No, look, I find the analogy I gave more straightforward, just because, of course, there's a standard analogy between tense logic and modal logic. And just take Kripke models, for example. In tense logic, the domain of the operator are past and future times, other times than the present. So in the most straightforward analogy, the modal analog is not past and future time, but non-actual worlds. So I guess just thinking in the terms of sort of semantics of tense and modal logic, that's the most straightforward analog.
Yes, but the medievals don't say that the sentence Socrates is in essence is true in some past world. They say it was true.
Yeah, it's true.
Doesn't that make a difference?
No, what they say is it's true at some past time. Okay, and if you think of past times as the analog, I mean those are non-actual times, right? And if you think of the analog of that as non-actual worlds, then that's the analogy I had in mind. I mean, in a sense, this is hypothetical, because I don't think as far as I know, the medieval nothing more than this is a sort of natural extrapolation of the view.
So you interpret the medieval treatment of past tense sentences something like it was means it is true in some past time or at some past time. So you somehow you somehow bring in the present tense form again. in your analysis or in your interpretation of the medieval analysis?
Maybe where do you see the use of the present tense there?
When you say it is true in past times,
Oh, so
is analogous to it is true in some possible worlds.
okay. So the truth predicate is tensed. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
No, sorry, I'm just
Okay.
thinking. I'm just thinking. Yeah, look, again, you're reaching the knowledge of my limits about the medieval views, but my guess is that they would say that. Okay. So what we're running into here is debates about tense in medieval logic, and of course we're talking about things like the sea battle and so on. So there will be a sea battle tomorrow. It's neither now true nor false. And if you take that claim is neither now true nor false, is significantly tensed, you've got the same problem about what you want to say about ascriptions of truth about the future, which are significantly tensed. So it looks as though you're going to run into the same problem again. What did the medievals say about this? I'm not quite sure. But probably at some stage you're going to have to appeal to an untense notion of truth, which is kind of moving to, the sort of move that I said, taking exists to be exist now, will exist or did exist. I suspect that sooner or later you're going to have to make that kind of move.
Okay, thank you.
Albert has another one.
Actually,
Sorry.
my second question was very similar to Andrea's question, so I decided to change. And I have a curiosity about an extension of your model Meinomianism as applied to particular metafictional cases. So you said that in the case of Anna Karenina, for instance, we say, well, which is similar to the case of your possible child, Anna Karenina does not commit suicide in the actual world. It is true in a possible world that Anna Karenina did so. Now, consider a case in which in the fiction, it is said that the character is fictional, right? It's not a standard human being. Yeah, for instance, so Pirandello's 6 characters in search of an author. That would mean that for one of those guys, correct, in that possible world. Correct. It has to exist in some other possible worlds. Correct. That are accessible from that world. Correct. And so my question is, according to your intuitions, are
But
we can mark on your historical picture. I think I think it's true that there were several non-theist views in the history, but it's an exaggeration if you say that it was a dominant view. example, in the 19th century, all the philosophers didn't have a monoist view. They had some version of the concept, and Bergman, also Lotze thought existence is standing in relations, and Bergman thought existence is standing into relation to oneself. Yeah, and also Aristotle is not, I think, an example, because I looked up also the special literature, and signify means meaning and not denotation. So what Aristotle in your quote says, that we have to think about that there's a meaningful to say something about this. He gives in the first analytic an analyze of the claim that a chimera does not exist. For example, the goat stake does not exist because the two universals are not co-exemplified. This is, so to say, a predecessor of the Frege-Russell view, and you can find it in the first analytic. So the idea is goat stake does not exist. Goat stakes do not exist because the universal of a goat and the stake is not co-exemplified. And so I think the first view had a non-exist view, and a very minimal view was for the Stoics. Avicenna, for example, had a similar view to Frege and Russell, or to Kant. He said that existence means that we have a bundle of properties in our mind, and there is nothing that corresponds to this bundle. And so even Leibniz didn't have a clear non-existent. Yeah, so he was struggling with the notion of existence, and only Descartes and Reid are examples. Hume also not. So I think it's more diverse than you often put it.
Well, I certainly don't claim that every philosopher before the 20th century was a monist.
No, it was the dominant view.
Well, okay.
The Middle Ages, yeah.
It was certainly the dominant view in the Middle Ages. Now, the other cases you've suggested, we'd have to look at them case by case.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not sure that it's as straightforward as you suggest. Look, I mean, here's the quotation from Aristotle. One can signify even things that are not.
Yeah.
Things that are not. You're quantifying over non-existent things.
Yeah, but you have to go into the context. And
But of course he thinks that the reason that they're not is that they have incompatible essences. But that's the reason.
Yeah.
Look at what he says.
Yeah, but what he means is...
What he says is, what he means is that...
Yeah, we shouldn't take it literally. So if you have what he really wants to say, you shouldn't take one sentence out and take it so literally. You can look at the literatures, for example, Christopher Shields is an expert in this, or David Charles. They all analyze this kind of context, and they give a completely different analysis.
Okay, so we now have an argument about Aristotle exegesis,
Yeah.
and I'm happy to have that, but we need to put out the text.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I was just going to say, Graham said two things that I remembered. One was that there was a common sense view was dominant before 20th century. And then he said how you spell out that common sense view we can talk about. And the nonist way is one way of spelling out the common sense view, that there are some things that don't exist. Maybe some of these other characters you spoke about had different ways, but that still stands in opposition to what Quine would say.
Yeah.
Whereas you couldn't say that. So I just wanted to point out that these are two different claims.
Yeah,
Common sense view and Graham's particular favourite way of spelling that out.
Okay.
Yeah, but Quine's view is also substantially different from the Russell-Frege view. Because
yes, Quine has a monadic existence predicate, and Russell thinks that's nonsense.
yeah, Frege has it also, but Quine doesn't think of a second order thing. So Frege thinks.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
But they both think that the claim that some things don't exist is either false or contradictory or nonsense.
Yeah, but there are also other authors before a lot. So I'm not so sure whether. So there are several authors who don't think that this is the common sense view. But I just wanted to say one has to be careful. I think that's all.
Yeah, well, to say that everybody in the history of philosophy believed Dex is always going to be false.
No, but it didn't say that. It was, it just said it was the dominant view, and then
Yeah.
you also say in this work on the quantifier, it's also more diverse. I think the picture.
Yeah. Look. Okay. Look. I mean, it would be silly to try and resolve this debate by just simply
Yeah, I
counting
know.
on this. Okay. So maybe dominant is not the right phrase. Maybe I should say a very common view, or people sort of thought that this was the common sense view. The 19th century is kind of interesting. I mean, I don't know so much about the German tradition of the 19th century. I know more about the British tradition. And then what you get is a debate about the syllogistic and the square opposition. So whether all A's or B's imply some A's or B's. And that's often put in terms of existential import by the English.
Yeah.
Okay. So you do find people talking about the existence of okay, so you find some British logicians in the 19th century talking about the existence of chimeras and fairy tale objects and so on. But they're usually at pains to point out that this is just a bit of a terminology to talk about the domain of quantification. And the existence there is no more than is a domain of quantification, and the domain can contain fairy tale objects and things. So existence there is a kind of a technical term, just meaning in the domain of quantification, which may contain, you know, what things we think of as non-existent. So again, I mean, this sort of takes us back to one of the first underlying questions. You've got to be careful about what you mean by existence. You can just mean in the domain of quantification, and if that's all you mean, well, that's what you mean. But I mean, I take your point that, you know, the history of philosophy is kind of variegated, and then when it comes to arguing about what particular philosophers said or meant, we get the text out and we argue.
Yeah. Okay, so we are already over time, so we have now lunch, and we will meet again at 1:30. Thanks a lot.
Yeah.